time speaking at the seminar. So today I'm going to talk about the resilience of coastal communities in British Columbia regarding their fuel management. I'll start with an overview of the local fuel networks and then introducing my modeling work and provide some discussions based on the modeling results. This is where we are. We are in the south coast of British Columbia. We have abundant resources except for one, oil. So BC produces a very small amount of crude oil by itself and receive most of the crude and refined oil from Alberta and Saskatchewan by pipelines and rails. So after arriving at the lower mainland, the fuel destined for coastal communities is first transported from the distribution centers to the nearby port and then to the other coastal communities by marine transportation services. So these coastal and island communities in BC coast are highly dependent on marine transportations for their daily basic need. And they also varies from each other. For example, large population centers such as Nanaimo on the Vancouver Island has several tanks farms which are replenished daily. Powell River has 2 tanks farm replenished about every 3 days. And Hartley Bay, which is a First Nation communities in the north, has a small tanks that's replenished once per month. So these tank farm operators has their own fuel inventory management strategies. Some keep their tanks as close as full, and the others try to keep the smaller inventory to minimize their cost. Based on the description, you must have a general understanding of the coastal communities' dependence on marine transportations. And actually, we are facing risk from different resources. Natural hazard and human-induced events are threatening the well-being of these coastal communities. And it is also worthy to point out that we're actually in part of the Cascadian subduction zone, and it's susceptible to both interplate and intraplate earthquakes. In the case of disruptions, the fuel shortage is threatening the coastal communities' well-being, and the availability of the fuel is limited in the affected area because for the first reason, the fuel deliveries are cut down, and for the second, the local gas stations and refinery facilities themselves are often damaged. And the third one, people in the affected areas, as well as those people nearby, tend to hoard the remaining fuel reserve immediately after the disasters or disruptions. So we have a general understanding of how the whole fuel systems looks like, and there are actually several resilience options to enhance the resilience of those coastal communities. We can do it by preventing an event from occurring or prepare to respond to a disruptive event. Options like capital investment, storage and warehousing, and warning systems are helping the whole supply chain and communities to enhance the resilience. Previous research mainly focused on how to enhance the supply chain performances. And also the other options are like the warning systems to inform the people about the information, but few research has been focused on the community side or the demand side of the fuel and fuel supply. Which means, in other words, the strategies within the coastal communities authorities, such as reserve distributions and inventory management strategies are not adequately studied. So to investigate this problem, we built a hybrid model to simulate the fuel supply and demand of the coastal communities, and then tested the model in different scenarios. We abstract the following framework from the real case. So these are the 4 components of the modeling framework: fuel, community, individual, and disruption. The fuel is the main focus of our model. We have been focused on the fuel's inventory and also the supply and demand of the fuel. The other important component is communities. In our model, we mainly focus on the community's refueling strategies, or in other words, the inventory management strategies. And also, communities is responsible for providing emergency services, such as fire, police, medical services, and these services are dependent on the fuel for their operation. The other thing is the fuel distribution and prioritizations. These are within the authorities of the local community government. And the other component is the individual. As we mentioned before, the availability of fuel is limited because people tend to hoard the fuel in the case of emergencies. And of course, the last one is about disruptions. In this model, we're not focusing on what kind of disruption is here, whether it's natural or human-induced. Instead, we mainly focus on the scale and the affected areas of the disruption. In other words, where the disruption affects, and also the severity of these disruptions. So in the modeling, we use different methods to simulate the different components of the real world. We use discrete event. This is a modeling method that describes a discrete sequence of events in a time. So in the model, it's used to describe the shipping delivery behaviors of those transportation companies and ships. The second method is the system dynamics. It uses stock and flows and feedback loops to simulate the local fuel reserve. The third method is the agent-based modeling. The agent-based modeling is used for simulating the actions and the interactions of autonomous agents. And this method is used to describe the hoarding and the hoarding behaviors among the populations. So concerning the fuel resilience, we think there are actually 4 states of the world. The scenarios actually depends on whether there's a disruption to the supply side or whether there's a disruption to the demand side. And remember, we built this model from the perspective from the demand side, which is the community. So we mainly focus on, there are 4 questions that we are interested in. So will the disruption lead to loss of local fuel reserve? This is the first one. And the second one is, how long would it take to resume the normal operations of the fuel supply? And third one is, will the disruption raise fuel hoarding or panic buying? And the fourth one is, how much fuel will we need to support the emergency services? So when neither local or supply side is disrupted, we call it normal. In this condition, the supply and demand are all in the normal condition, and there's no impact on local fuel storage facilities. This is called the scenario 1. And in scenario 2, this is when the disruption, for example, like a moderate local earthquake, hits the local communities but left the supply side intact. In this case, the supply side is intact, but the local storage facilities are likely to be damaged, and there could be higher demand from local critical services. Scenario 3 is when the disruption only hits the supply chain. An example would be a shipping channel blockage, and in this case, the local communities are relatively intact and unimpacted. And scenario 4 is when both the supply and demand side is being disrupted. It is worth noting that such case is of much lower probability compared with the other 3. So after building the scenarios and and analyze the questions that we are interested, we tested the model in different scenarios. We built the model in the we built a case study based on the Power River. Power River is a the picture is a little bit so. Power River is actually on the left corner of this picture. It's a semi-remote communities that's located at the Sunshine Coast of southwestern British Columbia. The community has no scheduled fuel supply, and it is almost exclusively supplied by City Transfer, which is a local transportation company that provides general freight transportation services. In general, Power River received 2 or 3 barges of fuel every week, and it has been building its additional resilience by having large storage tank and trying to keep their tank as full as possible. So Power River is an ideal case for our research. It is a coast community that relies nearly completely on marine transportation for their fuel, and they have built their own refueling strategies. So we tested our model in this in the scenario 3, which is a disruption to the supply side. We mainly focus on the dynamic of the local fuel stock. So in the scenario 3, remember we mentioned before the demand side is intact, and there's a disruption to the supply, which is likely to raise the local fuel hoarding. And we want to see whether the local authorities' hoarding control would help them enhance their performance in an emergency. So this is a curve that represents the fluctuation of the local fuel reserve. The horizontal axis represents days, and the vertical axis represents the amount of stock in 1,000 liters. The curves increase instantly when it receives a fuel delivery, and it drops down at a certain rate, which is the normal consumption rate of the local community. Now, on day 5, there's a disruption to the supply side. If we do not take any measures, if the local government do not take any measures, the local fuel stock will be run out within 3 days, while it is likely to take a few weeks or for the delivery to be resumed. So the zero stock means there is no local fuel for critical services. So what if they trying to control the hoarding? These graphs tells us that it is important to take actions in time. If we wait for 2 or 3 days, there's no meaning to doing so. So let's see what if we do it timely. The orange curve stands for hoarding control restricted to emergency services. In this case, that means the government only provide fuel to support the critical services, including fire, police, and medicals, and restrict the public's access to the fuel. So in this case, as you can see, the drawdown restricted to emergency services has a much shallower slope, and they apparently survived the 7 days disruptions. The government could also try to restrict the hoarding in a much more moderate way, in which they could also provide fuel to the public, but trying to restrict the amount of fuel the public could get. So we rerun the model and see the result. Again, the event occurred on day 5. We limited the demand to the 80% of normal demand, and as you can see, the moderate control may be insufficient when facing a 7-day disruption. Also, it is important to notice that in many cases we don't actually know how long it would take for the normal supply to resume. So our model shows that the strong level of control may ensure supply for about 11 days for the Power River, and the median level of of control would ensure about 7 days. So here are some insights from the model result. It is important to pre-plan and coordinate with the local suppliers, police, and populations to to minimize the hoarding, and also it is important to implement the control in time. The other thing we have been interested in is the local fuel inventory management. Powell River has built its additional resilience by having a lot of fuel reserve. During our interview with the local gas station manager, so we asked about their refueling strategies. They answered that they fill up as soon as possible when there's a room for a tanker. And this is actually not really a clever strategy, because this is both costly, and if the local is impacted by a disruption, it is likely the local facilities will be damaged. And also, during the interview, they have mentioned that they have never been contacted by local or provincial authorities about their strategies. So we want to see whether the efficiency and effectiveness of the current inventory management strategy. Here is the result. So we run the model under scenario 4, which the supply side and the demand side is disrupted. So this figure shows the fluctuation of the inventory from day 1 to 10. The model runs under normal condition. On day 10, the instant drop in the graph shows that the instant drop in the graph represents the expectations of the fuel loss due to tank failures. And the more severe the disruption is, the more fuel is expected to be lost. In this case, the moderate event and severe event result in considerable amount of fuel lost and takes longer time for the supply to resume. And in these two cases, Powell River runs out of its reserve before the supply resumption. The outage may lead to social disorders and dysfunction of critical services, not to mention that those fuel leakage will pollute the surrounding areas and threaten the community safety. So we've coordinating with the local emergency planning committee to provide our modeling results to them and some suggestions. It is important to ensure the fuel supports to emergency services, and fuel demand from them actually determine the critical level of fuel needed. And also, the government need to coordinate with fuel suppliers for stored fuel level practices to ensure high probability of survival of the critical fuel stock. And the third one is it is important to coordinate with the population, police, and suppliers to minimize the cost. I want to end my presentation with a quote from Eisenhower. He said, "Plans are nothing, planning is everything." So based from my understanding, there's a very distinction between, there's a very distinction when you're planning for an emergency, because the very definition for emergencies is that emergency is unexpected. So even though we planned for it, it may not go as we imagined. But planning means everything, because a good planning will increase our understanding of the vulnerabilities of the system and help to restore and strengthen the system. So during our research, we have found that the provincial government claims eminent domain over fuel supplies in the event of a disaster, but they have not engaged key stakeholders and have no emergency plans in place. And also the institutional barriers have hindered the designation of roles and responsibilities of pre-planning. So here's the team members. I want to thanks all the team members, especially my supervisor Hadi, and also I want to thank Alexa for a lot of help from her. And I'm willing to answer any questions. Thanks.
Try to take a few minutes of questions, try to get back on track. Questions from you first? Yeah.
Okay, actually the different modeling methods are used to describe different components of the system. So they are actually in the same model. It's a hybrid model that combines the three different methods. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so from my knowledge, BC has been very lucky in this case. We have not really experienced any severe fuel shortage recently, but during our research, we came across a case in Nova Scotia, and it was a human-induced case when there's a delay in the first shipment, and then there's another delay in the following shipment, and that result. The beginning of the disruption sounds not severe. It's just a delay of the shipment, but it actually results in a 3-day of fuel shortage in the town in the Nova Scotia, and it was in that case. I remember a report talking about a report investigation of that case, talking about the fuel hoarding behaviors among the population in that town, and this is apparently an emergency that the local authorities hasn't really expected. So they didn't really take any efficient strategies or actions to help alleviate the condition. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the original aim of this whole project, not really restricted to mine, but the whole team project, is to look the supply of food, fuel, and medical services. We have gone through the fuel things and also the medical things, but we haven't really gone to the food. One reason is that we lack access to people who are in charge of the food supply among the region. And also we've been focused on because we started with fuel because we imagined that it would be the simplest case, because food is different from fuel. There will be perishable food and non-perishable food, so it's even more complicated compared with fuel. But apparently, we may still need some time to look into the food issue. Yeah.
I have a quick question too.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you said about the refueling strategy of filling up as soon as there's space for the tanker as being costly and a risk? What's the nature of the risk, and why is it costly to the distributor?
Because so the refilling strategy in the Powder River, they try to keep their tank as full as possible.
It's the community tank?
Yeah, it's the community tank for the local gas station, and they try to keep it as full as possible because Powder River is a semi-remote community. They think they will be abandoned in some case, so they try to build additional resilience by doing this. But trying to keep your tank as full as possible, in physics, when imagine there's an earthquake or some other disruptions that physically impact the tank, when the tank is much fuller, it is more likely for the tank to fail in that case. That's why it may not be a very clever strategy to keep too much fuel in your tank. So instead, the clever strategy is to keep the tank half full, but trying to make sure that we distribute the fuel reserve in a clever way, and to make sure that we could still support the critical services. So that's the idea. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Xuesi.
Thanks.